Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use this Chic Merry Christmas Betterpress plate, and I'm going to share with you 5 different ways to use Betterpress plates. The first one is going to be the traditional way, and then I will ink on the background, and then we'll change from there, and I'll share with you some different ways that you can use it. So I'm lining up the Betterpress plate on the base of the Betterpress system, and then I'm taping my paper onto the clear plate. I know one of them is the chase and one is the platen. I can't remember. I can never keep them straight which one is which. But once you've got that done, I'm taking the Betterpress ink and I'm inking that Betterpress plate really, really well. I want to make sure that I get a nice clear image. So I kind of like to smear it on there gently, and then I press it on and get a little bit more ink to make sure that the whole thing is completely inked through. Then I put the top on the base and put it through my Platinum 6 machine. And it never ceases to impress me how beautiful the Betterpress images are with their indented pressing. So I used regular Betterpress paper for this from Spellbinders, and I'm just taking this background and I'm just ink blending it. That Merry Christmas, or the Merry part, just looks like a tree. I'm assuming that's what it's supposed to be. So I'm going to ink it as such. So I'm taking some bundled sage ink and I'm ink blending that part. And then I'm taking a little bit of peeled paint that I will put on the bottom of that paper. Now I did wait for this ink to dry, for the Betterpress ink to dry for a few minutes before I started to do this. It dries fairly quickly, but I wanted to make sure that there was no chance that I was going to smear anything. Once I have all of those greens done, I can start working on my blues. The first blue that I'm blending with is Speckled Egg, and then I will follow that with some Tumbled Glass, and then lastly I will go around the top 3 edges with some chipped Sapphire. I'll go back in a little bit later and add a little bit to the bottom as well, just to kind of frame the entire thing. I'm starting with the lightest color ink and then working my way darker, and you want to make sure that the surface you're blending on is nice and clean. I realized I hadn't cleaned up the green from before, and I wanted to make sure not to risk getting that on the top part of my image here. So always best to clean as you go, or clean up any colors that aren't the ones that you're currently blending. Now I'm doing the chipped Sapphire around the edges, and I love this color ink because it's just a nice dark colored ink, perfect for ink blending with different skies and whatnot. These are all distress inks that I'm using. I wanted to use distress inks because they are dye based, they're transparent, so they're not going to cover up any of that better pressed image. If you wanted to use oxide inks with this, I would suggest ink blending first and then doing the image over top of it, so that you're not using the oxide ink on top of the Betterpress ink. Oxide ink has some pigment qualities to it because it's a dye pigment blend, and so it has some opacity to it, and it would definitely change the image and make it not quite as clear. Once I trimmed that down a little bit to put on the front of my card, I took some Fossilized Amber and just put it where that star would be. And then I took the chipped Sapphire again, and this time is when I go over and around all 4 edges. I kind of thought it looked like it was missing on that bottom part with the green, so I put it there as well, but I didn't put it quite as heavily as I did on the top 3 edges. When I trimmed this down, I only trimmed it to 4 inches by 5 1/4, so it's going to be perfect on the front of a card. I thought it needed a little bit of sparkle, so I took a Jelly Roll pen, the Stardust one that has just a little bit of sparkle to it, and I'm using it along the edges of some of the letters. Those thick lines there, I'm only putting it along one line, but it just adds the right amount of sparkle. I started with just that star at the top, and it just looked like it really needed it around the edges of some of those letters, and it really finishes it off. Once I cleaned up after my ink blending, I decided to take a straight edge of a ruler and go around the sides of the cardstock with that same sparkly Jelly Roll pen. It's a really subtle sparkle to it, but it makes a nice shimmer in the light. You could also do a metallic jelly pen here instead of a sparkly one, but I didn't want to add too much to it. This is perfect because it's fairly transparent, but it just adds a little glimmer when you tilt it in that light there. Once that is done, I set that aside to dry for a few moments and then glued it to the back of my card base. I have some Barely Art glue here that I put in a fine tipped bottle, and I'm just putting it right to the card base. So I've got a little bit of a matte from the card base to the image, but I really love that bright white against the ink blended background. And that sparkle gel pen is the perfect touch. The next way that I'm using this Betterpress plate is for hot foiling, and I've done this part before. I love how these Betterpress plates look hot foiled, and knew it would be absolutely stunning with this card or with this Betterpress plate. Now, this in itself, I think would make a very simple and elegant card. Just that Arua foil on that white background is stunning. So I'm also taking the extra foil and doing the solid hot foiling. I want to use this for the matte behind my image. This foil that I'm using is the Arua, so it's gold, but it's got a bit of an iridescent shine to it. And as far as I'm aware, there's no cardstock that you can buy that's already like this. So by doing that solid image, I can make sure that my matte matches that gold perfectly. And this particular image, I think the solid image with the white writing is a little bit much. I think it's really elegant, the white or the gold on the white, but I don't think I'd ever use the solid image all on its own. I think it's just a little bit much. So this is the perfect use for it, using it as a matte around the other image. I'm using the Barely Art glue to glue it together and putting an acrylic block on it just to hold it down while I'm putting glue on another piece or freeing my hands up for something else. It makes sure that it dries nice and flat, and I have to say, this one here to me is absolutely stunning. I love that foil. I love the iridescent glow. So my third technique here, I am taking some white watercolor paper from Ranger and I'm taping it to my base here. And I'm using an embossing powder tool to dust all over that paper. I'm going to emboss this image, and I want to make sure that that embossing powder only sticks to the areas that I have my Versamark. So I'm using a Versamark ink pad. I'm making sure to press it nice and firmly on my Betterpress plate, but I don't squish it down. A Versamark pad is nice and foamy, and I don't want to risk getting that ink anywhere else. So once I had that embossed, put my top to the bottom, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and I have a nice Versamarked image. I'm going to use some rose gold embossing powder on here. You can use whatever color powder you want. I'm trying to make sure that each one of these cards have a different color to the letters. And I love this rose gold. I think it's absolutely beautiful. So I put that powder on there, put the excess back into the container, and I'm using my embossing tool to heat that up. I want to make sure that everything is melted before going on to the next step. And this metallic powder is usually pretty easy to see exactly what's melted. It goes from a granular, dull look to a nice, shiny, smooth look. And the color is absolutely gorgeous on this background as well. Now, once again, you could leave this background like this, just have an embossed image and leave it as it is. This image itself is just so beautiful and elegant all on its own, but sometimes it's nice to have ideas of what else you can do with it. So once I have this completely embossed, I'm going to take my watercolor paper. I like to spray my surface, spray the background, and kind of suction it into place before moving to the next step. And then I'm going to use distress-free inkers and ink or watercolor my background. So I like to use the distress refills because they are transparent, they've got a lot of color to them, and they blend with each other really easily. So that first color I used was peeled paint, and then I'm using scattered straw, abandoned coral. After that, I went and put a little bit more peeled paint down. And I'm using a wide watercolor brush here because it makes it so much easier on a background to get that color spread out really, really quickly. So this one here, the purple, is wilted paint, and then I do weathered wood. And the last one I'm using is chipped sapphire. This is why I used the watercolor paper at the beginning, because I wanted to make sure it could handle the moisture. You could also use mixed media cardstock. That would work as well because that can handle the moisture as well. And it looks really, really pretty having this background with that metallic embossed look to it. Once that is completely dry, I'm cutting or trimming down the edges, and I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. Now I could leave it like this, but I think it would look really beautiful with a rose gold matte. Now, I don't have any rose gold paper, so here is the next best solution. I'm taking some strong Suk Wang that is 1/8 of an inch wide, and I'm going all around all 4 edges. Now, I don't overlap the corners because you do get a ridge and a bump there if you do that with this particular tape. So I'm just cutting it and then making sure to butt that cut end up to the other piece that I'm putting it next to. Once I have this all the way around, I'm going to take that backing off and put some of that same embossing powder on these pieces, and then I'm going to emboss it. This tape will hold that embossing powder, and it creates a faux matte that frames the entire thing, and it matches that rose gold perfectly. I know there's rose gold cardstock available. It just wasn't in stock at my local store, and I live in Canada. Probably would have had to wait weeks for it to come in. So this is the next best solution, and it's a great way to use the supplies you already have to get a look that you want. So once this is on here, I'll use my embossing tool and I will heat that up. It creates a beautiful frame, and you can tell that it's not behind the image, but that's okay. It just frames it. Now, before I forget to mention, if there's a supply that I've used or something that I haven't covered, I will have all the supplies that I've used for each one of the cards listed and linked in the description box below. And if there's something that you're wondering, just put it in the comments. I'm happy to help, happy to answer. Often I'll have many ideas of what I want to say when I'm doing these things, and my mind sometimes goes blank while I'm doing the voiceover for them. Now, I love how easy it is to emboss right on this Be Creative tape or the Suk Wang. That tape holds the embossing powder so well. It doesn't move at all when you're embossing it, and it creates a really nice bumpy look to it that works perfectly for what we're doing here. And it works with any embossing powder. You could also use embossing glaze, and this also works for glitter. If you're doing a technique on a card that has a little bit of glitter to it, you could use this tape and have a glittered edge or a glittered frame around it. It works perfectly. Once that is done, I'm taking that Barely Art glue, putting it onto the back, and I will glue it onto my card base and put that acrylic block on there to hold it nice and flat. This is done on watercolor paper that's had water, and often they start to warp and bend a little bit. So by putting that acrylic block on there, I can make sure that the glue has really good contact and it will dry nice and flat. And there we have another beautiful image with the Betterpress plate. So for my fourth one here, I need to take my media mat off. We're going to be using some alcohol inks on Yupo, and you can't use it on that media mat because it's going to stain it. I'm going to use some Vaseline on a makeup sponge and lightly dab it onto that Betterpress plate. I'm making sure to only do it on the raised surface, and that's why I'm taking that Vaseline from the jar and then tapping it in the lid to make sure that I have a even amount throughout the whole thing, that I don't have a thick glob somewhere. I usually, for doing this, go over the Betterpress plate twice just to make sure there's not an area that I may have missed. So once I have that done, I have my Yupo already taped to the clear plate. I put the two together and put them through my Platinum 6 machine, and that will transfer the image with the Vaseline onto that Yupo. Once I have that done, I can start working with my alcohol ink. Now, because we use the Vaseline on the Betterpress plate, you want to make sure to clean it off thoroughly before you use it with anything else. We don't want to get that onto our ink pads or onto anything else. I'm putting it aside for a moment so that that can sit there while I do my alcohol ink background. I'm using denim alcohol ink, and I'm just using isopropyl alcohol with it, and I'm using Pinata Brass for my metallic because I think metallic with this background will look absolutely gorgeous. I use an alcohol ink blower to blow that around, and I have that isopropyl alcohol in both a mister as well as a dropper bottle. It's nice to be able to mist the entire surface if you want, but it's also nice to be able to have it in a dropper bottle and just concentrate it in certain areas. This alcohol ink blower tool is perfect for moving those inks around. I can make sure to get rid of any areas that are a little bit too heavy, and I can have a little bit of control over here. As I work with alcohol inks, I'll often add a little bit more ink where I think it needs it, as well as the metallic. I always add a little bit more of the isopropyl to move that around. And the one thing I love about the Pinata Brass metallic is that it can handle that isopropyl. Often when you use metallics from Ranger, you need to be using the blender solution. It doesn't like the isopropyl with it, but the Pinata Brass works just fine with it. I made sure to add a nice dot of that metallic right where that star is. And then once I'm done doing my entire background, I will let that completely dry, and I will clean all of that alcohol ink off of my surface before we move on to any next steps. Now, because I have that Vaseline under there, you can see that it's pretty much covering it right now, but once it's totally dry, we'll take a paper towel and we'll start to rub at it. And anywhere we had a buildup of that Vaseline, it's going to start removing it. It's going to resist that alcohol ink. I'm moving the paper towel on here fairly gently. I don't want to be pressing and rubbing really, really hard. I also like the kind of grungy, not super clean look that this gives it. It's just a little bit of a different look, which is cool, and a different way of using these Betterpress plates. Now, the thicker lines and thicker areas from this plate, I can take my nail with that paper towel and kind of rub it a little bit harder to get rid of any of that excess that is there that I don't really want. And I do that a little bit, but I don't want to do it too much. I kind of like the grungy organic look that it gives, so I don't want to completely remove that, but I did want a little bit more of the white area in some of those areas, so I did do it a little bit, but I didn't make it completely pristine and clean, because that's not the look that this really gives. Once that is totally done, you can trim that down and then add that to your card background. And because when you remove that Vaseline, it creates a white area. It works perfect on a white background. I'm using that same Barely Art glue. I'm going to put that acrylic block on there while it dries. And then I decided to take one of these champagne glitter drops from Pink Fresh Studios and add that to the star area. It just highlights that and centers that star at the top there. And I think it's the perfect touch on there. And I just put a little bit of that Barely Art glue there and then use my tweezers to position that. I'll let that dry completely, and once that's totally dry, here is the card for this one. And I love how that turned out. It's such a different look for those Betterpress plates, but I was really, really happy with it. So to clean that Vaseline off of that plate, all I did was used a baby wipe to take off any excess, and then I used some archival ink cleaner and made sure to clean off the rest. I wanted to make sure that there was no chance that I had any of that Vaseline still on there. So made sure that it was totally dry or totally cleaned off, as well as totally dry. I didn't want to risk any of that cleaner underneath there, and then repositioned that plate for the last technique. So for this last one, I'm using some black Distress Mixed Media Heavy Stock, and I'm going to tape that to the clear plate and make sure that I don't have any fingerprints on there. I'm using some Brilliance metallic ink pad here, and I have a brand new pad. This is another sponge pad, so I'm being very careful to only tap it on the surface. I'm not pressing down. I don't want excess ink pooling around the outside of that Betterpress plate. Put the top to the bottom and then put that through the Platinum 6 machine. Now I'm using silver here. It also comes in gold as well as other metallic ink colors. You can use whatever color you want. I wanted my metallics to be all different for all the different cards. And once I was done that, I chose to put some clear embossing powder on here. Now it's going to have a similar look to using silver embossing powder, but it does look different. If you have the resources for it, emboss something with silver embossing powder and then use silver ink with clear powder. It has a different look to it, and I really like this look sometimes over the silver metallic. It's one of those differences that you can't really explain in words. I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder, and then I trimmed that down so it was 4 inches by 5 1/4, perfect for the background of an A2 card again. And I will glue that to the card. So this is another one that's very, very simple. There's no extra techniques to this. It's just the pressing and then embossing. If you didn't want to use that clear embossing powder, you could just use that heat tool and heat set that pigment ink, but you do want to make sure to heat set it. It takes a long time for pigment ink to dry, so heat setting it just quickens that a little bit. Very last step for this one is I'm just taking a iridescent clear drop from Pink Fresh Studios, gluing it with that Barely Art glue, and there is the finished card. So I hope you enjoyed learning 5 different ways to use those Betterpress plates. Each one of them is a little bit different, a little bit unique, but it's always fun to learn different ways to use the supplies that we have. And in my opinion, it makes them a little bit more valuable knowing some different techniques to use with those things. Some plates will work better than others for some of these techniques. So have fun, play around with them, and tell me which one is your favorite. I'd love to hear it. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.